And I am very happy to introduce Dr. Richard Smethurst, who's a specialist. He's a Japanese historian who's a specialist of the 20th century and has done a lot of work on World War II. And he's going to be talking to us about the non-economic thinking of the Japanese decision makers for war in the 1930s. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Smethurst.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
You have to speak up a little more.
Oh, can you hear me? Hello? Okay, good. I'd like to, before I get started on the presentation itself, say a little about my background. I first arrived in Japan, think about this, guys, January 1957. I was a very young second lieutenant in the United States Army, and I was lucky enough to serve in the Army after Korea and before Vietnam, for which I'm forever grateful. And I didn't want to go to Japan, but all of a sudden I found myself there and I fell in love with Japan. But think about this. Here is a 23-year-old American kid in love with Japan, and this is 1957. So it's only 12 years after the end of World War II. It's only 15 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's only 20 years or so after the rape of Nanking. So from the beginning of my time in Japan, and this, I've been involved with Japan now for the last 57 years, of which I've lived about 20 of those in Japan. I've been trying to answer the question, how do you reconcile these two Japans? The friendly, kindly, courteous, well-organized, efficient Japan, and the World War II Japan. And I've spent the last 57 years thinking about that. Second of all, as you know, if you read the newspapers, and I'm sure you do, you know there's a big debate going on in Japan today over how Japan should view their role in World War II. Were they, as some people say, trying to liberate Japan, Asia from Western imperialism, or were they vicious militarists? Both are possible, but what I've attempted to do in this presentation is to look at Japan's decision for going into World War II. Not in terms of this is what we want to do, this is our moral responsibility, et cetera, but try to look at it in economic terms. Japan undertook a war from 1937 to 1945 that it had no chance of winning. So even if it had a legitimate reason for going to war, and I'm not saying it did, but even if it did, it had no chance of winning this war. Moreover, it undertook this war in spite of the fact that prominent Japanese political leaders, most notably for today's discussion, Takahashi Korekiyo and Ishibashi Tanzan, who I pick out to discuss largely because I've spent more time studying them than other people, pointed out, one, that Japan could not defeat the United States and Great Britain and China and the Soviet Union in a war. It just didn't have the economic wherewithal to do it. And not only that, but in fighting a war with the United States and Great Britain and China and the Soviet Union, it was fighting the countries that it depended on for raw materials. I'd like to point out to students in my, well, I'm retired now, I pointed out in classes that I taught on modern Japanese history that without doubt, the petroleum that powered the planes that attacked Pearl Harbor came from Texas or California or both. That is, the United States was the primary source of Japanese raw materials in the beginning of World War II. China had a population 7 times Japan, which made the pacification of China very difficult. Japan invaded China in 1937, but a population 7 times. How do you pacify a country that doesn't want to be pacified by your terms of pacification when they have 7 times more people than you do? When they had not successfully worked out that problem, they attacked the United States, which had a gross national product 5.5 times Japan's at the time of Pearl Harbor. If you look at this table here that I put up there, 1941 is not the peak. That's about 1943, but it's the, as you're going up the peak, it's that X down there between a million and 100,200,000. But even then, it had an economy 5.5 times larger than Japan's. On top of that, this share of world manufacturing output. In 1936-39, so on the verge of World War II, the United States produced 32% of all the manufacturing output in the world. Japan, about 4%, 3.5%, 4%. 9 times the productive capacity, and that was after the United States had been in a 10-year depression, which you can see as you see our share falling. It's because 1926 to 29, 1936 to 39 is the World Depression. But even in the Depression, the United States was still the leading manufacturing country in the world. How could you go to Japan with this country? But look at this data. Japanese imported war materials. In 1938, 57.1% of Japan's imported war materials came from the United States. 20.7% came from the United Kingdom and its empire, so Malaya, Canada, India, Australia, and the Dutch and Dutch East Indies produced 8.6%. In other words, over 86% of Japan's imported war materials came from the countries that it went to war with in 1941. Moreover, Manchuria and Korea, much vaunted by Japanese military and civilian planners as the industrial base and substitute for imports for an autarkic, that is an economically self-reliant Japan, did not come close to making up the difference. Let me give you 2 examples. Japan's continental holdings, that is Manchuria and Korea, at the height of their steel production in 1943, produced only 1/10 of Japan's finished steel. Japan, including Manchuria and Korea, produced a total equal to 11.4% of American steel output in that year. Thus, Manchuria and Korea's joint steel output equaled 1% of America's output. The U.S. produced 52.5%. Second, the United States in 1934 produced 60% of the world's oil. 60% of the world's oil was produced by the United States. Japan produced 0%. There was no oil in Japan. And the Japanese Empire, 0.45%. That is, a half of 1%. In other words, Japan and the empire produced 1/130th of America's oil production. Where did Japan get its oil? Largely through exports. And 55% of those exports came from the United States. As you can see, Japan not only didn't use much oil, which meant they didn't have ships and planes enough to use a lot of oil, but also they depended on the United States for about 40% of the oil that they had and about 55% of their imports. In other words, Japan, by going to war with the United States, not only took on a country that was stronger than they were, but it also cut them off from the benefits of that American supply. Once the United States committed itself to building a wartime economy, it carried out a stunning industrial, scientific, technological, and logistical program during World War II. A few quantitative examples. Look at this table here. I love this table, by the way. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced 11.9, almost 12 times more steel than all of Japan. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, produced 3.3 times more steel than all of Japan. And that's including Manchuria and Korea. In other words, if the Japanese wanted to win World War II, what they should have done instead of seizing Manchuria is to seize Pittsburgh. The United States produced 2.15 billion tons of coal to Japan's 185 million tons. The United States produced 325,000 airplanes to Japan's 76,000. Oh, this is coal, excuse me, airplanes. The United States produced 1,191 warships to Japan's 157. And this is a biggie, because one of the points of my presentation tonight is logistics wins wars. The key to winning a war is being able to make goods and get them to where you want them. The United States produced 34 million tons of merchant ships. Japan produced 4.2 million tons of merchant ships. I don't know if any of you ever watched the movie Mr. Roberts, but it's all about a little freighter that carries goods across the Pacific Ocean. This is one of the keys to victory, is the ability to produce goods and get them there. And we'll come back to that as we go on. The American scientific achievement, and I have to say I'm not going into the morality of some of these weapons, we'll put that aside, but the American scientific achievement was just as great. Walter Grundin, in his book, Secret Weapons in World War II, Japan in the Shadow of Big Science, writes of how the United States made 3 major breakthroughs in developing the science of warfare during World War II that Japan couldn't come close to matching. They were nuclear energy and the atomic bomb, radar, and jet aircraft and missiles. While Japan had scientists capable of doing these things, of inventing these machines, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the raw materials, and they didn't have the organizational ability to operate a centrally directed science program. Let me give you an example. Both the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy were working on the development of radar. They not only didn't tell each other about what advances they made in their research, but they actively hid it from each other. That is, the Army and Navy simply did not tell each other and made an effort not to tell each other what they were doing. American big technology was also impressive. I follow Grundin in defining big science as the development of new kinds of weapon systems. I define big technology as the improvement of types already in existence. A few examples. At the time of Pearl Harbor, probably the fighter plane, the fastest, the longest, the most maneuverable, and the plane with the longest range of any plane in the Pacific was the Mitsubishi Eisei, the Zero, which you see on the left of that picture up there. On the right is the Navy's primary fighter plane in 1941, the Grumman F-4F, which couldn't come close to the Zero in speed and maneuverability and in range. Of course, one of the reasons was the American planes were much heavier because we built protection for the pilot into our planes, and the Japanese didn't. And we'll come back to that a little bit later in our talk, why they didn't. And also the Army depended on the P-40, most famous as the flying Tiger with the Tiger mouth. But this was the primary Army Air Force fighter plane in 1941. It also was slower and had a lower range than the Zero. But by the time you get to 1943-44, the United States has produced 2 new airplanes. One of these is the Corsair, the gull-wing Corsair, the wings that folded up on aircraft carriers so they could get more on the deck. And the Cadillac of the Sky, the P-51 Mustang, the Army Air Force's primary fighter plane. Both of these planes were as fast as the Zero, have the range of the Zero, and have far more protection for the pilot. What happens is they're heavier planes, but they have more powerful engines, and that made them just as fast. But the most remarkable example of American big technology is this one, the B-29 Superfortress. This, for the times, was a really giant airplane. 99 feet long, 141-foot wingspan. Of course, by today's jets, it doesn't look so big, but in 1942, 43, 44, this was a very big plane. It had a top speed of 365 miles per hour, which meant that it was as fast as the Zero. This was a bomber that was as fast as the Japanese fighter plane. It had a range of 5,830 miles, which allowed it to fly round trip from Saipan and Tinian in the Mariana Islands, where the bases were located, bomb Tokyo, and get home again with ease. And it carried a 20,000-pound bomb load. In other words, you can get 10 tons of bombs onto the airplane. Curtis LeMay. I don't know how many of you know who Curtis LeMay is, but Curtis LeMay in 1945 took command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Mariana Islands. And he transformed the B-29 from a plane that was developed to drop high explosive bombs from 25 to 30,000 feet into one that could drop fire bombs, napalm and other fire bombs from 5 to 9,000 feet, largely because the Japanese didn't have any air defenses. And not only that, but on I don't know how many of you have heard of the famous March 9th, March 10th air raid of Tokyo, but this is a raid in which 100,000 people were killed in one night. I mean, more people were killed in Tokyo on March 10th, 1945 than in Hiroshima in August, albeit it took 334 planes to do this in Tokyo. But basically, since LeMay found there were no air defenses, if you look at a B-29, go back to this picture, you notice that there's a tail gunner, there's a belly gunner who you can't see, there's two turret gunners on the top, and 2 side gunners, so 6 gunners who have protective guns for the airplane. He took all these off the plane because there were no enemies to shoot at. So if you took 6 gunners off the plane, what's average person, probably 200 pounds, 180 pounds, you're talking about a half a ton of people, plus you're taking all the machine guns off, so you could probably get another ton of bombs on these planes. And basically, they bombed Tokyo, burned central Tokyo to the ground on the night of March 10th. And this went on and on. All told, between November 24th, 1944 and August 15th, 1945, B-29s bombed Tokyo 41 times, Osaka 20 times, and Yokohama 23 times. And think about this, folks. I don't know how many of you have been in Tokyo, but I spent a lot of time in central Tokyo, Azabu, Yotsuya, Hongo, where Tokyo University is located. On March 24th, 525 B-29s bombed that part of the city, and the next night, 470 B-29s bombed that part of the city. This is incredible productive logistical capacity. Brutal. I mean, this is not a moral question. This is an economic question. In June and August of 1945, when Japanese air defense systems were non-existent, B-29s bombed the city of Toyama. I don't know how many of you have been to Toyama over in the Japan Sea. It was 99% destroyed. Little Kofu, where I've spent a lot of time in the past doing research, was 80% destroyed. I mean, we were burning anything that moved. Not only did the United States outclass Japan economically, industrially, scientifically, and technologically, but also think about big logistics. Brings me to this book, 5 Days in August, by Michael Gordon. And it's a story of naval sea beats. The Mariana Islands fell in the summer of 1944. And on the island of Tinian is one of the Mariana Islands. I think yes, you can't really see this here, but if you look at that map, about a third of the way up from the bottom, you see Saipan and Tinian. Those were major B-29 bases for the bombing of Japan. In several months, and maybe 3 months after Tinian fell to the United States in August of 1944, CBs built 5 8,500-foot runways. They built 11 miles of taxiways for B-29s. They could launch and land 8 planes a minute. Think about that if you ever sat in an airport waiting to take off. 8 planes a minute. This is an incredible operation. The CBs mobilized, think of this, 450 trucks, 55 power shovels, 50 power graders, 125 giant carryalls, 150 tractors and bulldozers, 75 wagon drills, 12 welling drills, well drilling rigs, and 120 air compressors. They built 942 structures around the airfields, including hangars, chapels, mess halls, and barracks, not to mention wells, roads, 4-lane highways, baseball fields, tennis courts, and beaches for swimming, so the Air Force people could swim. It's all in the middle of a war. Nearby Saipan and Guam were something similar. In other words, they were building these things. But also, think about this. You had to get these B-29s to Tinian and Saipan and Guam. You had to get the fuel, you had to get the food, you had to get the bombs, you had to get the construction machinery. At the peak in 1945, there were 50,000 American military personnel living on the island of Tinian, which was 12 miles long and 6 miles wide. And basically, they built a town for these people to exist and work in. Now, this is, to me, really big logistics at its most impressive. And it also brings me back to my statistic about merchant shipping, because a lot of that stuff was being hauled to Tinian and Saipan. The B-29s could fly there, but the rest of the stuff was coming by merchant ship. In spite of the overwhelming superiority of the Chinese, in spite of the overwhelming superiority of the Chinese in population in the United States and the British too, in industrial, scientific, technological, and logistical capacity, the Japanese military in World War II fought a multi-front war over an area I calculate to be 30 million square miles. If you look at this map, it starts in the Aleutian. They took the island of Attu in the north, all the way down to Guadalcanal and Gilbert Islands and the Marshall Islands in the south, then over through New Guinea all the way to India, up through China. The Japanese were operating over about 30 million square mile area. And not only that, but because let me go on to say that the Japanese Army, as the Pacific War began in 1941, numbered about 2.9 million people. Even in 1944, when they had begun to draft younger and younger and older men, it included only 5.9 million men, less than half the size of the American military. And this is not counting the Chinese. Moreover, these men were spread thin, as we've seen from this map. But not only that, they were fighting Chiang Kai-shek's regulars and Mao Zedong's guerrillas in China, and the Japanese stationed 600,000 soldiers. Think about this. We have an army of just under 6 million men at its peak. So 10% of the Japanese army is stationed in Manchuria, where the Japanese aren't fighting because they have a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, but they don't trust the Russians. So they station 1/10 of their army in Manchuria, which means it can't fight in all these other places. They've really spread themselves there. As a teenager, like many American boys, I went through my war phase. I read all of Bruce Catton's books on the American Civil War and somehow found my way to B.H. Liddell Hart's classic, Strategy, also entitled The Strategy of the Indirect Approach. What I took away from this book was the idea that the job of generals and their staff officers is to sit coolly and without emotion at their desks and weighs the benefits and costs of starting a war. What are their goals in going to war? Their prospects of achieving those goals, the anticipated costs in lives, in money, in destruction, and the war's impact on their society's values. Do decision makers have a reasonably clear idea of how to end the war and how the post-war peace will be better than the pre-war peace? I picture these officers with sheets with yellow legal pads with a line down the middle. On one side they have pros, on one side they have cons. It doesn't seem to me that the Japanese staff officers in 1937 and 1941 were doing this. Or, if they were doing it, they were using incorrect assumptions. Now, several Japanese argued repeatedly in the pre-war years that Japan could not defeat China, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union in the war, and by antagonizing these countries and their allies would also reduce their own economic and military power in the process. I introduce here Takahashi Korekiyo, Prime Minister and 7-time Finance Minister between 1913 and 1936, and Ishibashi Tanzan, economic journalist and editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, only because I know more about them. In fact, as you can see here, I wrote a book about Takahashi, so basically I know a lot about him. This is a man who, think about this, if you've studied Japanese history, you probably come across the term Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong army. This was a catchword in the late 19th century among Japanese government leaders. In 1885, Takahashi wrote a memo to the finance minister in which he used the term rich country, prosperous people in place of rich country, strong army. He understood, in other words, that the goal of the government is to make the country and its people more prosperous, not to increase the country's power out in the outside world. Now, he became famous because in 1904, Japan went to war with Russia. And Takahashi was sent to London and New York to sell Japanese war bonds. I mean, picture yourself a New York or a London investment banker. Who's there? I'm Takahashi from Japan. We've gone to war with Russia. I want you to buy Japanese war bonds. Would you invest in Japan? He raised, think about this, he raised 130 million pounds. That is 1.3 billion yen. 5 times his government's 1903 budget by selling Japanese war bonds on the London, New York, Paris, Berlin, and Hamburg financial markets. In other words, Japan defeated Russia in 1904 and 1905 because we paid for it. 47% of the cost of Japan's victory over Russia came from New York and London. Think about that. So when he came home from Japan, he wasn't opposed to empire. But he believed that if you're going to have an empire, you have to have an empire within the Anglo-American, within the framework that the British and the Americans raised. Thus, he approved a plan to build railroads in Manchuria, which Japan gained economic control of when they won the war against Russia. He approved a plan to build the railroad using American money. E.H. Harriman, the famous New York railroad builder, said he'd like to build the railroads in Manchuria for Japan, in joint effort with Japan. And Takahashi thought this was a great idea for 2 reasons. One, Japan was capital poor. They just fought an expensive war. They were capital poor. And 2, if the Americans were involved in running the railroads, this would weaken the military. I don't know if any of you have heard of the 21 demands to China, an attempt by the Japanese during World War I to become the primary imperialist power in China. Takahashi opposed this, publicly opposed this. He advocated the appointment of civilian army and navy ministers until, actually, there was never an army minister or navy minister before World War II who was not a general or an admiral, an active duty general or admiral. He advocated civilian ministers. He advocated abolishing the general staff system. In 1933, when Japan left the League of Nations over the conquest of Manchuria, he opposed leaving the League of Nations. He had a very good record on standing up to the militarists. The cabinet meeting in 1933, let me tell you what this picture is before we go on. This is his farewell dinner. Actually, it's December 14, 1904. The date is wrong up there. If you look at the picture, you see a shorter, dark, bearded man in the middle of the back row, looking a little bit pompous. That's Takahashi. But next to him, a rather elegant-looking English gentleman is Sir Ewan Cameron. You know what Sir Ewan Cameron's great-grandson does today as his job? Does anyone know? He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And if you go down 2 more people, you see a white-bearded man. That's Lord Nathaniel Rothschild. So these are the people who paid for this victory over Russia. Sir Ewan Cameron was the head of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. These are the people Takahashi opposed. These are the generals he opposed. This guy in the middle, Adachi Sadao, Takahashi said to him in a cabinet meeting in 1933, "Are there really idiots in the army who think Japan can defeat the United States in a war?"
He said that?
He said that in a cabinet meeting. This is a sitting finance minister, you know. The man on the right, General Kawashima, Takahashi said in another cabinet meeting in 1935, "Does the military plan to go to war with both America and Russia? You think you can occupy New York, Washington, and even Moscow? You say regularly that you can win, but if the enemy doesn't put up his hands and surrenders, you can't win. You know you can't possibly occupy Washington and Moscow." On August 19, 1935, Takahashi met with the Soviet ambassador to Japan. Even that was amazing. Meeting with a Soviet ambassador, you know, the Japanese finance minister meeting with a communist. I mean, he was a gutsy guy. He said to the Soviet finance ambassador, "Those who brandish the sword perish, while those who show morality flourish," is something I believe. If the Japanese military continues doing what it is doing, in the end, it will probably perish. This is a sitting finance minister. This isn't just some newspaper correspondent out there. But Takahashi and Ishibashi Tanzan, the other person whose picture I showed you before, who repeatedly wrote of a small Japan, that is a Japan without empire because it was less expensive to buy out natural resources on international markets than to maintain an empire, had no impact on the men who should have had the yellow legal pads. The Army put together a 500-page dossier, and this is the cover of it, of position papers written between 1920 and 1926, in which Army General Staff officers criticized Takahashi's plan to abolish the general staffs and to have civilian Army and Navy ministers. In other words, they are well aware of what he was doing. One of the essays in this file is called "Party Politics Are a Thing of the Past." In the words of Field Marshal Yamagata, quote, "National defense is fundamental and financial policy follows." Takahashi, of course, said the other way around. He wasn't opposed to national defense, but you can't have national defense if you can't afford to pay for it. But Yamagata said, no, defense comes before money. You can find it somewhere. When Takahashi became prime minister in 1921, Yamagata wrote, "The Seiyukai is a party of commonplace ideas and thieves." He called the appointment of Takahashi as prime minister, quote, "a continuation of the thieves." In other words, people didn't listen to these guys. This picture you see on the left is a bronze statue of Takahashi in a park in Tokyo. He was assassinated by army officers on February 26, 1936. On a rare event in Tokyo, a snowstorm had hit Tokyo the day before. This picture I got this morning by internet on the 78th anniversary of the February 26th incident a week ago. This picture was taken, so it's snowed again in Takahashi Park 78 years later. But this is what he looked like in this statue anyway. But unfortunately for Japan, people didn't listen to people like Takahashi and Ishibashi. So why did the commanders and their army subordinates invade a country with a population 7 times there? Why do they attack a country with a population twice theirs, that's the United States, an economy 5.5 times theirs, and a share of world manufacturing 9 times theirs? Did they really have reason to believe that they could fight a 4-front war against the Americans in 2 fronts? You know, we had 2 fronts against the Japanese. the British and the Chinese that win. On the pro side of the pad, Japan seemed to be in the middle of a winning streak in the 1930s. In 1931, Japan's army officers engineered the seizure of northeast China, what we then called Manchuria. When the United States protested and the Japanese government tried to stop the army, it simply ignored them and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. When Japan was censured lightly by the League of Nations, I mean really lightly, the League of Nations didn't say that they'd done something morally wrong. It just gave them a light censure. They left the League of Nations, as we've seen against Takahashi's will. While the Americans and some of the League's members spoke loudly about the seizure of Manchuria, they didn't carry big sticks, or in 1933, any sticks at all. We were in the middle of a depression. So the Japanese figured they could get away with whatever they wanted to do. In 1937, Japan invaded China, again inviting protests from the United States. But again, the United States, mired in an 8-year depression, did nothing. In fact, the United States was the biggest exporter of war materials to Japan. We have seen statistical data above on U.S. exports of war materials. Let me show you a piece of qualitative evidence. I'm sorry this picture doesn't come through clearly. I hope you can see it. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Duquesne Club. The Duquesne Club is the elite business club of Pittsburgh, which until, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, women couldn't join. Of course, lots of other people couldn't join as well. But on December 7th, 1939, George T. Ladd, the man sitting in the front, to the front right, who was the president of United Engineering Foundation Company, a company in Pittsburgh that built steel rolling machines for steel mills, entertained Colonel S. Atsumi, the man sitting to his left in the picture, is Colonel Atsumi in civilian clothes. He entertained him at the Duquesne Club. And in 1938, UEF, that is George Ladd's company, had built a factory to produce steel rolling mill machinery in Japan. In other words, Japan was fighting a war with China, and the United States was building steel equipment factories in Japan to help them win the war. The Japanese military said the Chinese are resisting us because of British and American support. Actually, it was the other way around. The people who were getting the British and American, particularly American support, were the Japanese. As you know, in this period, not only were American companies, as I just pointed out to you, supplying raw materials and technology to Japan, but we were in the midst of a rampant isolationism. That is to say, many, many Americans simply did not want to get involved in any war. China's a big country. They can take care of themselves. Why do we have to go help? On August 12, 1941, so August, September, October, November, 4 months before Pearl Harbor, and a month after President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States, a bill came before Congress to extend selective service, that is the draft, the ability to draft soldiers into the Army to prepare for the coming, what Roosevelt saw as the coming war. A bill to continue the draft after its first year came before Congress, and it passed the House of Representatives by one vote. Think about that. 203 to 202. In other words, if they did not pass the House of Representatives, not only would the draft be ended, but all the soldiers who were drafted the year before would have to be sent back home. So this is only 4 months before Pearl Harbor, and almost half of the American Congress votes against preparing for the war. The Japanese military attaches in Washington certainly read the newspapers. They did not see the United States committed to fighting an all-out war. On top of that, on September 27th, 1940, Japan signed a treaty that brought it into alliance with Nazi Germany. Thank you for putting FDR up there for me. Doesn't look at all like Bill Murray, does he? Well, I thought Bill Murray did a fine job. I like that movie. Anyway, the military leaders expected that an alliance with Nazi Germany would strengthen both their diplomatic and military positions vis-a-vis the United States, as their alliance with Great Britain in 1904 had helped them defeat Russia. But there were things to be put on the negative side of the legal path as well. Japan invaded China in the summer of 1937. And by 1941, they had not brought China, they had not pacified China. The Chinese were still resisting. And even by December of 1941, 180,000 Japanese soldiers had died in China. All told, 410,000 Japanese soldiers died in China. Almost half of them have died before Pearl Harbor. In other words, this was a horrendous war that they weren't winning. It would seem to me that you should begin to think about, maybe we want to step back. Maybe this war isn't really worthwhile, but they didn't do it. Since the Japanese army at its largest had about 6 million men, and at their peak they had about 1 million men in China, 410,000 dead soldiers is a very, very high casualty. But even more than the fact that they weren't winning the war in China that they'd been fighting for 4 years, this brings us to Nomonhan. I haven't even heard of Nomonhan. Nomonhan is a place on the border between Manchuria and Mongolia, Outer Mongolia. Outer Mongolia was under Soviet control. If Manchuria was a Japanese puppet state in 1939, Outer Mongolia was a Soviet puppet state. There was a battle took place there between Japanese and Soviet troops, and the Soviet army committed massive number of airplanes, tanks, and artillery to counterattack against the Japanese, who had an early victory. Now look at these two tanks on the bottom. If you had to choose between those two tanks just looking at them, which one would you choose? Which one don't you think the tank on the right looks a little bit more powerful than the one on the left? Mm-hmm. Well, that was the Russian tank. Its cannon was bigger than the Japanese cannon, it was faster, and it had more armor protection, which brings us back to what we were saying before about airplanes. In this battle at Nomonhan in September of 1939, 12,000 Japanese soldiers out of 15,640 in the 23rd Division, so basically 80% of the soldiers in that division were killed or wounded in about a 2 or 3 week battle. Of all the Japanese soldiers there, about 20,000 out of 60,000, so about a third of all Japanese troops involved, died or were wounded. This man on the left, you may have heard of Georgy Zhukov.
Everyone should.
Famous Soviet Red Army general in World War II. His first use of mass tank attack came at Nomonhan against the Japanese, and he used the same technique later against the Germans on the other front. But the point here is that, oh, and by the way, I should point out that one of the things that people found who worked in the Japanese army hospitals was that when they worked on wounded soldiers, they were primarily wounded by artillery shrapnel. In 1904, 1905, the nurses and doctors who worked on wounded soldiers found they were mostly gunshot wounds. But here it was mostly artillery fire from tanks, airplanes, and so forth. So what's going on here? Well, Edward Drey, probably the premier, excuse me, historian of Japanese pre-war army, has written that the Japanese moved into World War II with an approach to wartime strategy and tactics based on a misreading of the reason for Japan's victory over Russia in 1905. Japanese believed they defeated the Russians in 1905 because of the superior spirit, seishin, of the Japanese soldiers, not because of British and American money. British warships, you may not know this, but of the 17 large ships in the Japanese Navy in Admiral Togo's fleet in 1905, 14 of them were made in British shipyards, and the other 3 were made in France and Italy. That is, the big battleships in 1904, 1905, all came from European shipyards. Money, technology, and diplomatic support. I mean, the United States and Great Britain supported Japan in their war against Russia, and I won't go into why. You can read my book. I've got 2 chapters on it. But what they came out of this was the idea that the close order attack is the primary way to fight, both offensively and defensively. Soldiers close together moving forward. Now, you know what happens when you move forward close together against artillery and tanks and enemy airplanes. And that's, of course, what happened at No Manhattan. But they never gave up on this, even after No Manhattan. Look at these figures. These are troops committed in deaths in selected World War II battles against the United States. And this doesn't come just at the end of the war when the Japanese are desperate. It comes at Guadalcanal, which is early in the war. Basically, American soldiers killed to the number committed comes to about 5, 6, 7% of total soldiers committed. Japanese figures are 85, 90, 95%. Basically, if you're a Japanese soldier at one of these battles in the Pacific, you were dead. You didn't come home. You were never captured. Why? Well, because, I mean, there are lots of reasons, but one is that soldiers were being used as cannon fodder against weaponry that was far superior to theirs. I don't know if any of you have seen Letters from Iwo Jima. There's this wonderful scene when these 2 Japanese soldiers come out of the cave and they look out and they see all the American warships out there and they say, we thought we were winning the war, but we've lost. I mean, it's overwhelming. Okay. I think, and this is something I'm looking at right now, that the greatest illusion in the years between the First and Second Sino-Japanese War, that's between 1895 and 1937, was the view among both Japanese leaders and Japanese rank and file people that Japan had become one of the great powers of the world. Japan was not a great power in the years before World War II. For example, Japan in 1922 were allowed to have 60% the number of battleships that the United States and Great Britain were allowed to have. And Japanese complained this is discrimination against us. But if you look at the size of the economy, each Japanese battleship costs 6 times more per capita than each American battleship because of the difference in size of the economies. In other words, a Navy 60% the size of the U.S. Navy was actually a big Navy given the financial standing of Japan. But people thought, you know, we defeated the Chinese, the Central Kingdom in a war. We defeated a European kingdom in a war. We were anointed a great power at Paris. Japan and Paris became one of the permanent powers of the League of Nations. They thought they were a greater power than they actually were. And I think this had a great negative impact on Japan. I think this cut across not just militarists and people who associate with the military, but across Japanese society. Japan in well, how many of you have heard of the gold standard? Probably not a lot of you, but I'll say a few words about the gold standard. The gold standard was a system that kept currencies tied to their value in gold, which meant the value of a currency could not fluctuate greatly. This began in Great Britain in the 19th century, largely because in the 19th century, Great Britain was the primary financial power of the world. By the time you get to World War I, countries had to do a lot of military spending. They had to increase spending, so they all left the gold standard. After the war was over, countries started to go back at the gold standard. Now the question was, you go back on the gold standard at the value of gold in 1914 or at the current value of gold? And there was a lot of inflation around the world during and right after the war. So if you went back on the gold standard at the pre-World War I level, you had to deflate your economy dramatically to bring your currency in line. So 4 major countries, United States and Great Britain, go back on the gold standard at the pre-World War I level. This had a dramatic negative impact in Great Britain, by the way. France and Italy went back on the gold standard at the current exchange rate. So the Japanese in 1929, 1930 decide to go back on the gold standard, and they go back on the gold standard at the 1914 value of gold. This severely deflates the economy just as the world is going into a major depression, which is deflating. So they get a double depression. Now, why did they do this? These guys weren't dumb. The prime minister and the finance minister who did this weren't dumb. But why did they do it? Because going back up the pre-war gold level of value of gold is what great powers do. Notice the country with an economy the size of Italy's, actually smaller than Italy's at that time, thought they were the United States and went back on the gold standard following the United States and Great Britain, not following Italy and France, which were actually closer to them economically. So this was not just the military. People were getting carried away with their feelings of greatness. These are the 2 guys I want. They're actually good guys. I mean, they were anti-militarist. Both of them got assassinated for it. So I mean, they weren't bad men. They just made a wrong choice in 1929, 1930. Here you see Prime Minister, World War II, Army Minister, Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, his wife, and his granddaughter. Why am I showing you this picture? Well, that one little girl in the middle is Yuko Tojo, who said in an interview reported in the July 11, 2007 Japan Times, her grandfather undertook a war in 1941, a war of self-defense, to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. The United States forced us to go to Japan. We had no choice. She went on to say, quote, if there was one mistake, it is that we lost. If my grandfather is to blame, it is not because he started the war, but because we lost. The conclusion of my paper is guilty as charged. He started a war he couldn't win. Whether he had a legitimate reason or not is irrelevant to my argument. The point is that he started a war he had no chance of winning. And at some level, he knew this. When he was still Army Minister in September 1941, he told Prime Minister Konoye Fumimoto, quote, at some time during a man's life, he might find it necessary, with eyes closed, to jump from the veranda of Kiyomizu Temple into the ravine below. That's the veranda of Kiyomizu Temple. It's about 100 feet from the veranda to the ground at the bottom. To me, jumping off the veranda at Kiyomizu is suicide, not good planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dick. I'm going to, Patrick, if you could take off button number 2 so it stops pushing content. And I'm going to unmute everybody now so we can start asking some questions. And also change, hi everybody, also change the layout here so we can see each other. And I know I'd like to start. Elizabethtown we can't see them. They can only hear us. I was wondering, David, do you want to start? Do you have any questions or comments? You're a Chinese specialist. What do you think of this?
Oh, I enjoyed it immensely, and I think your argument is, very, very interesting. We often talk about should Japan have gone to war on a moral ground, but just from a simple strategic and economic point of view, it was suicide. Does anyone here at Elizabethtown have a question? Do they want to start the questions? We've got one. This is Tim Spiegel, who's going to ask our first question. Here he is.
Hi. So you focus primarily on differences in the economies between Japan and the West. And I'm curious, what is your thinking about why Japan felt it needed to go into mainland China, not just Manchuria? I've always understood it to be primarily political reasons for the Japanese in terms of communism and whatnot.
Well, there are a number of interpretations of this, but the one that's most widely accepted is that the Japanese did not plan to invade China. There was no blueprint for how we're going to do this. It happened by accident. Now, we'll come back to what I mean by accident, quotation marks, in a minute. But the point is that it was well understood that there was no benefit to Japan from the conquest of China. Most of the raw materials that China had were in Manchuria, that is in northeast China. You had a densely populated China. What could you actually take out of China that would be useful to Japan? Very, very little. The Japanese military was in a competition game. Wars bring promotions, that sort of thing. The Manchurian army was carrying out all kinds of activities. The Japanese had an army in China. Now, why did they have an army in China? There's a China specialist in Elizabethtown, so he knows this. At the time of the Boxer Rebellion, a treaty was negotiated between the Boxers and various countries, Japan, United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, I think, that we could station troops in Beijing to protect our embassies and legations from so-called Chinese, I don't know, Boxer type people, bandits, whatever. The Japanese pushed this. I think we had something like 500 U.S. Marines in Beijing. The Japanese pushed it until they had 10,000 troops stationed in the Beijing area. Now, what I've read recently is that one of the local commanders decided that he would take some of his troops on night maneuvers in the outskirts of Beijing because he wanted to cause an incident like the one in Manchuria, so that the army in Manchuria could get some action, and therefore one assumes some promotions. And he did this. There was no order from Tokyo to do this. This was done locally. The local commander, this man wasn't the commander, he was a staff officer. The local commander, understanding that this was not a war we want to fight, I mean, the primary hypothetical enemy of the Japanese army was the Soviet Union. The Navy was the United States. We were wasting our resources if we fight a war in China. The local commander negotiated a truce with the local Chinese warlord. Chiang Kai-shek did not directly control Beijing. And he was overruled by Tokyo. And this turned into an 8-year war. What originally was a skirmish, albeit a skirmish that was very likely to happen when you have 10,000 troops stationed in and around the capital of another country. Any spark will set off the powder keg. But nevertheless, there was no blueprint to invade China. So China got invaded simply by accident, and then people couldn't back out. In 1939, an officer proposed, this war is of no value to us. We're losing too many soldiers. Let's begin a staged withdrawal, and he was overruled.
Huh.
So the army was out of control. That's one of the things that.
Very strange.
Excuse me, I'm going on maybe too long, but we think of wartime Japan as an authoritarian country, maybe even a dictatorship, but there was no firm chain of command. There was nobody at the top who could tell the people below him, this is what you have to do. So even though the military were in command, there was no one, even General Tojo, who was the prime minister and the army minister, couldn't control his own army.
I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting. Baltimore, do we have anything from you maybe?
You just speak up.
Yeah,
The mic is right there.
I speak up here? Yeah.
Can you hear us here?
Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
we can hear you really well.
Okay. So one analysis you didn't mention that I came across in, I can't remember the author, but this is sort of an audio book, History of Modern Japan, and his analysis was that basically with the military leadership in Japan, it was basically an emperor's no clothes problem. That even though they knew full well it was a completely idiotic thing to do, they just didn't have the nerve to tell each other that this is stupid and stop it. And that was the nature of the problem. They fully knew well it made no sense, whatever. But they went ahead with the invasion of the United States and whatever, because they basically didn't have the nerve to tell each other that this is stupid and this step down. And, which to me was sort of a striking analysis, but I didn't hear you sort of, would you address that sort of view of things?
I agree with you. I think that is part of it. They simply, I mean, the obvious case is Admiral Yamamoto, right? Here's a Japanese admiral who's actually a high-ranking officer in the Navy Ministry in Tokyo in 1939, and his commanding admiral has him transferred to be the commander of the combined fleet because he's going around making speeches about the fact that if we go to war with the United States, we're going to lose. And yet it's he who took charge of the plan to attack Pearl Harbor, which we know, at least in retrospect, is the thing that brought the United States, which ended isolationism in the United States and brought us fully into the war. But I think you're right. I mean, there were no, well, I came across the following, this fits into what you were saying. I came across the following story in a book by a Japanese scholar that I was reading recently. A particular general was in Tokyo in the General Staff Headquarters, and an incident took place in China, and he sent orders out saying, you've got to stop this, you've got to withdraw. 2 years later, he's assigned to China, and he gets an order from Tokyo saying, you've got to stop this, you've got to withdraw, and he says no. In other words, the same officer, when he's in the central command and when he's in a regional command, has a different view. So they took on kind of faces of their own, you might say. But it was an organization of people. I mean, as you know, they went to the Army War College where they learned strategic planning, intelligence, logistics, all this sort of thing. And then they kind of ignored this when it came time to carry out campaigns that they knew at what level, as you said correctly, they knew they wouldn't work.
So we Bucknell popped up because somebody coughed. So it's Bucknell's turn. Hey, Mimi.
I have one question. You were saying how the different financial people, and I'm sorry, I can't remember all their names, how they warned against, entering into warfare and everything. Who exactly was behind? I'm just curious, behind the assassinations of all these people. Was it different military people or Tojo or, who in particular, assassinated them?
There's no evidence to indicate that high-ranking military officers were involved in the assassinations, the planning and carrying out of the assassinations. Takahashi was assassinated, the man I wrote about, was assassinated by young Army officers. Now, they were elite Army officers. They were Army officers, although only lieutenants and captains, who were on their way already knew they were on the way to the top. They were not just everyday officers. But nevertheless, there's no evidence to indicate that people at higher levels were involved in directly ordering them to do these things. There is evidence to indicate that when they did these things, they were not those were high-ranking officers who were not unhappy, put it that way. And after the February 26th incident in which Takahashi and several other people were assassinated, there was a debate over what to do about the officers who carried this out. And a large number of highly placed officers said what they did was wrong and we should allow them to commit suicide, to commit seppuku, harakiri, to disembowel themselves. In other words, they were given what is a form of execution, but a form of execution that has no stigma involved in actually doing it. And another group said, no, we've got to maintain discipline in the army. And in the end, these guys won, and they were tried and executed. But nevertheless, there was a large part of the leaders in the military who, even though they were not involved in the decision to kill these people, who wanted to give the murderers a quote, honorable way out of it.
So the murderers were executed?
Yes, they were
Okay.
executed.
Yeah, was there any warning in the, like the papers, or were there any threats to, like, the Takahashi and others before they were murdered?
They knew they were targets. Takahashi had a secret stairway in his house. But he refused to use it, by the way.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I have to admit, I'm not totally unbiased in my evaluation of this man. I think he was an amazing politician, but my view is that in one sense he committed suicide, and that he knew he was a target, but he didn't shut up.
There have been prior assassinations of people.
Yes, right. So,
Do we have anything from Slippery Rock? Questions, Armin?
Well, just kind of an observation. Most of the time, what I learned was that there was really a failure in the education of the military officers in their training. And it seems to me that it shows the shortcomings of the organization in the military versus the rest of the government in how decisions were made and not having any check and balances.
no, I mean, as you know, because you've obviously done some reading on this, the Army Officer Corps was divided into basically two groups. One was the elite track, and the other was the non-elite track. That's really profound, isn't it? Basically, about 10% of the Army officers who graduated from the military academy went to the War College. And these 10% were chosen on the basis of their grades at the military academy. As you may know, we have American military has a War College, and Dwight Eisenhower, for example, who graduated in the middle of his West Point class, got to go to the War College when he got to the appropriate age. That would never happen in Japan. If you didn't graduate in the top 10%, you didn't get into the War College. So these guys went to the War College where they learned to do strategic planning and all these things that we expect officers to do. The other 90% basically spent their whole careers commanding troops. And basically, if you didn't make it into the top 10%, you'd never get to be a general. The highest you could expect would be retired as a lieutenant colonel or a colonel. So there was a division. But this top elite were supposed to do all the things that I'm talking about here. But they didn't do them. And that, of course, gets to your question. And that was that for some reason, I hate to get into this spirit issue, but it's hard to avoid it. The fact that was really a sense of what is the term we use? Exceptionalism, Japanese exceptionalism. We may not have the economic power of the Americans or the weaponry of the Russians, but we have Yamato Damashi, we have the emperor, we have our particular spirit, our particular seishi, and that can make up for it. And I think at some level, people actually made decisions with this kind of view in mind. It's kind of scary, isn't it? You know, I was, as I said in the beginning, I was in the Army for 4 years. I was very lucky because I was after Korea and before Vietnam. If I'd been in the Japanese Army for 4 years, anytime between 1937 and 1945, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I'd be scattered in the rocks of some South Pacific island or somewhere in China. The expression, old men talk, young men die. You really come away with that feeling. But that's what gets, you know, I'm trying to be economically rational here, but I get angry because I think that these guys are doing this decision-making or non-decision making, as you're pointing out. But they're not the ones who are going up to die. Other people are the ones who pay the price for these decisions or non-decisions that are taking place.
I don't know if it's rule number one, but I'll call it rule number one. It would help to know your enemy or who you think is going to be your enemy before you embark on type of activities they did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Amy?
Did they, I mean, we showed a lot of graphs that were really interesting in the first part of the talk. Okay. But that, you know, that really is a lot of macroeconomic data. Do they have access to that kind of thing other than, you know, that was sort of as it was happening and we can look back and see those numbers.
Well, they didn't have access to all of it, but that's another aspect of this, which, I mean, I guess you wouldn't expect Japanese military officers to be aware of, but some of the data that I showed you comes from the 1930s and was published in the 1930s. The statistics on oil production in 1934-36 was published by, in an article by an American woman in English in a mainstream American periodical. Frida Utley, I don't know if you've ever heard of Frida Utley. Frida Utley was a British journalist who got in a lot of trouble because she was a communist in the 1930s when it wasn't a good time in Great Britain or the United States to be a communist, and she actually married a Soviet economist. He was executed during the Stalin purges, and she became an intense anti-communist later in her life. But nevertheless, the point is that she pointed out in a book in 1934, Japan has never won a foreign war without British and American assistance. And it's true. But people weren't reading Frida Utley. They weren't reading this woman who I forget what her name is, but the one who published the oil statistics. So some of this data was there. But Takahashi knew it. I mean, I don't have all the quotes. I could come up with, I have got a 400-page book. There are lots of quotes of things he's saying, but he understood very clearly that Japan was not a major economic power in the 1930s, and it should live within its means. And there were others. Ishibashi, the other man I mentioned, said, as I think I don't know if I emphasized it, it's cheaper to buy raw materials than conquer them. And so, you know, there were people who knew this. They may not have had exactly the statistics, and I've had that criticism before, but okay, these statistics look fine in retrospect, but did they have? But they had a lot of information, and they knew clearly, and there were people pointing out. I mean, the thing that's amazing to me about Takahashi is this guy's a sitting finance minister. Have any of you ever heard of Sidney and Beatrice Webb? Sidney and Beatrice Webb were British socialists who went to the Soviet Union in the 1930s and came back, and they wrote a book in which they praised the Soviet Union in 1935 as the wave of the future. The last known photograph of Takahashi Korikyo, the finance minister before he was assassinated, shows him reading this book. And not only, he made a point of having this photograph taken and published in the newspaper. He's not your typical Japanese, but there were a lot of people who understood this, even if they didn't have all that data. They understood that the United States, Great Britain were much, much more powerful than economically.
Oh, Patrick? Yeah.
Did you say that the Japanese had this awakening sort of late in the war, that they came, sort of the rank and file, the populace, came to realize that they couldn't win this, and they sort of came to it with a vengeance, spending time in Hiroshima and some other, war memorials. But the populace basically blamed not the foreign powers, not the U.S., not Great Britain and China and Russia, but they started to blame their own leadership. Like, what suffering of the war was not caused from outside; it was caused from their own leadership, failure in leadership. So it seems like they sort of came to this realization about 5 or 6 years too late that it was leadership, a failure of leadership. They got into a war that they couldn't win, and that was what caused so much suffering in Japan. It wasn't the Americans who caused it; it was the generals and whatnot. So they sort of came a little bit too late to realize that this was the war they couldn't win, and they came to understand that with a vengeance, it seems like.
When did the populace realize it, Dick? Do you think? The average person.
Well, I couldn't really say, but I'll venture a guess. I think the bombing. I think that, when you have a bombing in which 100,000 people are killed in one night, March 1945, that kind of gives you
the bombing in Tokyo. The firebombing.
Firebombing. And the bombing had begun before that, but it's really not until about February of 1945. Curtis LeMay is not one of my favorite people in the world. But he started firebombing because it worked. And it wasn't only him. There were places down in Florida where they built little wooden towns of wooden houses and saw to see how fast the fires would work under certain wind conditions. But I think that's when people really got the message that this war is going badly. Now, there's work done now, and I'm interested in this, on standard of living during the war. And there's a debate over this. There's a man named Kenneth Roth who teaches at Portland State University. He's written a book on the so-called 2,600-year anniversary of the founding of Japan, which took place, the ceremony took place in 1940. And he shows that people are making pilgrimages to this area as late as 1942. So it means the railroads are still working. People have enough money to get to various parts of Western Japan. But if you look at certain statistics, Janet Hunter, a woman who teaches at London School of Economics, has shown, for example, that by 1939, you couldn't buy new clothing because it wasn't being produced, because the textile factories were being turned into other things. Food shortages, by the last 2 years of the war, by 1944, the average caloric consumption was less than the caloric consumption that a person needs to stay alive. Now, we don't know how this is, to function. You don't die, but you become, malnutrition sets in. So by 1944, many people are beginning to be undernourished. By 1945, it's horrendous. And even after the war, the first year of the occupation, There are people starving to death in Japan. So, but I would say 1944 is really when it says it. So fairly late in the war, this is my value. Conversely, I was having dinner with a friend of mine, a Japanese anthropologist, retired anthropologist from Tokyo University. And he said to me, Dick, in 1943, I was drafted into the Navy. I was a Tokyo University student, so I was sent to officer training school. The first day of class, the instructor said, gentlemen, first thing I want to say to you is we're going to lose the war. Takahashi Korikyo's son, I've gotten to know his grandson very well. He's a good friend of mine. His father, so the son of the finance minister, the day after Pearl Harbor, he sold his family's house in downtown Tokyo and moved to the suburbs. As he said, eventually they're going to burn my house down. And so I want to get out of here, when I can still afford to get out. So there were people, I mean, it's...
People knew, yeah. Do we have any more? We have time for maybe one more question. Any questions from any of the other side? Oh, okay, Baltimore.
First a comment, if I might, and then a question. I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you. But as you were showing all the statistics of why Japan should have gone to war, I was thinking of some of Dr. Seuss's cartoons that depicted in a humorous light. But I wanted to raise the point, since you mentioned Yamamoto, that since he was naval attaché in Washington, he is a good example of someone who actually lived in America and saw for himself the auto plants of Detroit. So there were people that actually had lived experience. But the question I wanted to ask was about the jet aircraft, since you mentioned that as one of the American technological advantages. I saw some show on the History Channel about how that argued that Japan was on the verge of developing the jet aircraft at the end of the war, and had the war gone on longer, that the tide might have been turned. And I just wondered if you knew anything about this and might.
Well, what I know is that I watch the same program.
Okay. Well, should I believe it?
No, I'm still going to respond. There's no doubt in my mind that in all of these things that I talked about, Japan had the scientific and probably even technological ability to do them. There were Japanese physicists who were capable of working out an atomic bomb. We know that. The question is the logistics. And I think while the Japanese had the capability of turning out jet planes, and this is one of the things, this is my reaction when I saw that program, which I also watched, was that they didn't have the raw materials to actually turn this into a, if not mass-produced, even moderately produced weapon system. That was their weakness, not the scientific or technological capability, but the raw materials. I was told by somebody that there were school children who were given stones that had uranium in them and told to scrape them to get uranium out of them. When that's the way you get your raw materials, you're in deep trouble, is the way I see it. So it's the wherewithal that's the key. It's the money. They simply couldn't afford to do this. I mean, I don't know if maybe you've seen this. It's a wonderful anime film by what's the man's name? Miyazaki. His last film on the development of the Zero. It's really a
What's it called, Kevin?
Wind Rises.
The Wind Rises?
And it's just in theaters in Pittsburgh
Just
now,
came
so I'm
out.
assuming it's going in other cities too.
Yeah, I saw it in Tokyo without subtitles. I'd like to see it again. but the point is that this is a brilliant achievement that this man pulled off. But the question is, how you turn out an adequate number of these. So the Japanese, this was a modern industrial country that we're talking about. I wasn't trying to say it wasn't, but it's scary sometimes when I think about the fact that for almost my entire life, I've lived in a country that's the richest and most powerful country in the world. It really shapes the way you think about the world. We were in World War II the richest and most powerful country in the world. And Japan, while they had the capability of doing many, many things, they simply did not have the money, the wherewithal, the raw materials to pull it off. And of course, as you know, Japan also depended on long supply lines, right? There's one thing I left out of my talk, and I got in trouble the last time I gave this presentation. I talked about bombers, but not submarines. Because I'm not really talking about the outcome of World War II, but American submarines. I have a former student who was a warship buff, and he came up with a list of all the Japanese merchant ships by name sunk in World War II and how they were sunk. And about 90% of them were sunk by American submarines. You couldn't get, if you needed fuel to fly a jet plane, you had to get it into Japan, right? By 1944, 45, that was pretty hard to do.
Wow, well, this is great. Constantine, did you want to say anything else?
No, I just said thank you for the
Okay.
answer and for the talk.
Yeah.
We've never met. I don't know why.
Oh, wait, I think we have one more from Bucknell. Okay, one more from Bucknell.
I'm just curious if you've ever expressed this perspective to a Japanese audience, and how was it taken by the Japanese people?
I gave this talk in an earlier version at Waseda University in Tokyo, and it was very successful. Let me say one thing in conclusion. One of the things that's striking is the number of Japanese who are now writing about the Japanese military and the origins of World War II. When I was a graduate student, the big field was the Meiji Restoration. That's how Japan became a modern country. Now you have people looking at the 1920s, 1930s in great detail. And not one of them, and these are really serious people at major universities like Kyoto University, Tokyo University, Waseda, not one of them defends what Japan did in the war. The overall academic writing about World War II is critical of the Japanese military and the Japanese government. And I'm stunned by this. I mean, because I expected, a few other views to I've only read parts of 20 books in the last 2 years. They're all on this track. In fact, in some ways, I have nothing to say because they're saying it all. It makes it nice for me. Walk on the, sit on the shoulders of giants, so to speak.
That was a really good question. Thank you.
I like
that was
that.
great. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody.
No one asked me about Shinzo Abe, and I don't want to talk about that.
Let's do Abe some other time.
Another time.
And we got a week break, and then in 2 weeks, David Kenley is going to be talking for us in our last in the series, and that's going to be a great talk. We're actually going to have David do it from Bucknell. So wave hi, Mimi. He'll be up there doing it live at the Bucknell site, which will be great. And I want to thank all of you for coming in tonight. I don't know if Elizabethtown still hears us, but we'll say good night for tonight, and let's hope the weather's a whole lot better in 2 weeks, okay?